She was buried before she took her first breath, but that baby lived. And with nothing but a name carved in wood and a fire lit by a little girl's hands, one family stood against a monster in the dust. This isn't just survival. It's the kind of Wild West legend that'll stay with you long after the fire dies. Stay with us and see why her name was Mercy. Out in the high desert of Arizona, beneath the looming silence of Monument Valley, there comes an hour each morning that the world forgets how to breathe. It's not night anymore, but the sun hasn't claimed the sky yet. In that stillness where even the crows won't call, a man hears things he thought he buried long ago. Calder Hayes knew that silence well. He lived with it like an old wound that had never truly closed. He sat on his porch as he always did, cradling a tin cup of black coffee that had gone cold too fast. The boards beneath his boots were warped and cracked, worn from years of him pacing in and out alone. The war had changed him, sure, but it wasn't just the battles or the blood. It was what he came home to. Empty rooms. Echoes that sounded too much like memories. These days, Calder didn't wait for anything. The world had stopped bringing him surprises. Or so he thought. It began as a shape at the edge of his land. No noise, no call. Just a presence, small, fragile, still. At first, Calder wasn't even sure she was real. In the shifting light with the morning not quite formed, she looked like a ghost pulled out of the dust. A girl, no older than 7, barefoot, and trembling, her dress stiff with dried blood and dust. In her arms, she held something wrapped in linen tight against her chest, like she was the only thing keeping it from vanishing. Calder didn't move, didn't call out. Years of solitude had taught him the value of quiet. Instead, he watched. The girl didn't run, didn't cry. Her eyes, hollow and too old for her years, stared right at him. When she spoke, her voice cracked like dry wood. "We're not here to steal, just to survive." That was when Calder stood. Not fast, not with panic, but the way a man moves when he's seen something holy and broken all at once. He walked slowly across the hard earth, each step measured so as not to raise a cloud of dust that might spook her. When he reached the fence, he crouched eye level with the child. "She your sister?" he asked, nodding at the bundle. The girl blinked just once and nodded, she breathing. Another small nod. "May I see her?" The girl's arms tightened around the bundle. For a heartbeat, Calder thought she might run, but then, as if every ounce of strength left in her had crumbled, she let go. The weight fell into Calder's arms, light as feathers, yet heavier than anything he'd held since war. He peeled back the corner of the linen with fingers more gentle than they'd ever been. The baby's lips were blue, her skin pale as bone china. Her eyes stayed closed, but her chest moved. A breath. Barely. That was enough. He didn't ask where they'd come from. Didn't ask what had happened. He just said, "Let's get her warm." Inside the cabin, the fire was a mere glow, but it hadn't gone out. Calder placed the baby in a wool-lined basket near the hearth. He poured warm water into a tin basin and handed a cloth to the girl. "You wash. I'll see to her." She didn't answer, just nodded, moved like a ghost, and obeyed. As the fire revived, casting golden shapes on the log walls, Calder worked. He found a clean dropper from an old drawer, warmed milk from a tin over the flame, and fed it gently to the baby's lips. Her breath came softer now, still shallow but sure. The girl stood nearby, hands still, eyes watching like a hawk, like she was memorizing everything. Calder caught her stare. "What's your name, Ellie? I'm Calder." That was all they said. Later, while the desert turned from purple to copper outside, Calder found Ellie curled near the hearth. Her eyes weren't closed. She watched the baby, not blinking, not moving. She got a name, he asked gently. Ellie didn't look up. Not yet. Mama didn't have time. That stopped Calder cold. He didn't press. Instead, he knelt by the fire, brushing a lock of matted hair from the baby's forehead. Is your mama... Ellie swallowed. She was alive, when I left. But he thought the baby was cursed. Said God didn't want her. He started digging. Calder's stomach turned a deep ache rising in his chest. Mama pushed me out the door, said, "Find the ranch with bees, the quiet man, he won't turn you away." His throat closed. He hadn't kept bees in years, not since the swarm left one spring and never came back. But he'd once been known for it, and the memory stung more than he expected. "What's your last name?" he asked. "Mercer?" Calder went still. He'd heard that name. Everyone in these parts had. Dwight Mercer. A man feared more than respected. A drunk. A brute. A man whose land rotted east of Santa Fe like a wound the desert refused to heal. Now, Calder knew exactly who the girls were running from. Ellie stood one hand on the doorframe like she was ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. "You hungry?" Calder asked. She shook her head. "I'm not, but she needs more." He nodded. "I'll ride into town come morning. We'll get her what she needs." Outside, the desert was beginning to stir. The first streaks of light pushed across the dirt like fingers looking for something lost. Calder walked out to the porch again and stared at the horizon. The wind had changed direction. It carried a taste he didn't like. Dust. Distant hooves, maybe. Or trouble looking for a home. Something was coming. He didn't know what yet, but he felt it. The way old men feel a storm long before the clouds roll in. And this one had the smell of unfinished war. The journey into town wasn't long, but it felt like another world. Calder rode with the baby, pressed close to his chest, bundled tight against the crisp morning air. The desert stretched wide its silence, only broken by the occasional creak of saddle leather or the distant call of a hawk. But in Calder's chest, the quiet had a different tone. Something anxious. Something waiting. Flagstaff was just waking up, and already eyes turned as he rode past. Men nodded with narrowed brows. Women paused mid-sweep of their storefronts. No one asked questions. Yet. But they would. Towns like this didn't forget when someone who never asked for help started walking into stores buying baby clothes. Miss Dottie ran the general store like a preacher ran a pulpit. Sharp eyes, quicker judgment, but a heart that had been cracked more than once. "You're early," she said as Calder stepped inside. Her eyes flicked to the bundle in his arms. Or, unexpected. Milk, cloth, linens, a tin of balm if you've got it. Dottie didn't blink. Just walked to the shelves. "Yours?" she asked over her shoulder. "No." She turned, placed the items on the counter one by one. "But you brought her here. She's breathing. That's what matters." "She's lucky," Dottie said softly. Most men would have walked away. Calder didn't answer. He left with the supplies, the baby still wrapped close to his chest, heart beating next to his own. Back at the ranch, Ellie had not wasted a minute. The floor was swept clean, new kindling laid carefully, and a pot of warm water waited near the hearth. She looked up as Calder stepped in. Her eyes locked on the bundle, then flicked to his face. "She's still breathing." He nodded, stronger. Ellie exhaled tension, leaving her shoulders. She reached for the baby with such care as though afraid the warmth might have vanished in the moments he'd been gone. He handed her a new dress. "For you." She held it like it might dissolve. "Thank you." That evening, Calder cooked a thin stew with what little he had. Beans, carrots, some old dried venison he'd been saving. Ellie ate slowly, eyes always drifting to her sister. She asked no questions about Calder's past, and he offered none. Silence became their truce. Later, as the fire danced low, Calder stayed close. The baby made soft sounds in her sleep, half whimpers, half dreams. Ellie sat beside her, one hand resting on the woven basket, her head tilted as if listening for something deeper than breath. Then came the knock. Soft, too soft for trouble. Calder stood hand to his rifle. He opened the door and caught her just as she fell. Ruth Ann Mercer, blood on her dress, dust on her cheeks, her breath shallow, her body trembling from a fight that hadn't yet ended. Mama Ellie screamed. Calder carried her to the fire, laid her down with care. Ellie knelt beside her, whispering her name over and over. The baby stirred. Ruth Ann's eyes fluttered. "You found him," she whispered. "I did," Ellie choked, "and I told him," she said through tears, "we're not going back." Outside, the wind shifted, and in that small, quiet cabin, something broken began to stitch itself whole again. Morning came with smoke-colored light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Calder woke before the sun as he always did. He checked the baby, still sleeping warmer now. He turned to Ruth Ann, who lay wrapped in one of his old wool blankets. Her eyes were closed, but her chest rose and fell with more certainty than before. Ellie sat on the floor beside her, chin on her knees, eyes open. "You didn't sleep?" Calder said softly. "I didn't want to." "Why's that?" She hesitated. "Sometimes when I wake up, things are worse." Calder nodded, saying nothing. He understood. By mid-morning, Ruth Ann stirred. Calder helped her sit up, supporting her back with a pile of folded blankets. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Safe?" Ellie answered, reaching for her hand. Ruth Ann's eyes moved from Calder to the baby, to the little fire crackling in the hearth. Tears welled, but did not fall. "You brought her here," she said to Ellie. "I had to. You told me." Ruth Ann reached for her child. Calder passed her gently. She held the baby as if it might vanish, as if her arms alone were the barrier between life and the grave. "She's warmer," Ruth Ann said. "She's stronger." Ellie smiled for the first time in days. That night, Calder found Ellie outside carving something into the porch rail with a pocket knife. He crouched beside her. "M-E-R. What's that A name?" Ellie said. "I want her to have one." Calder watched her carve the final letter. "Why, Mercy," she said, "because that's what she was given." Calder stared out at the desert. The wind had calmed, but it still carried that strange scent, like rain that didn't come, like secrets buried too long. "Mercy," he repeated. "That's a good name." And for the first time in years he meant it. Some promises are made with words, others with the silence that follows suffering. And then there are the ones made in the flickering warmth of firelight, when hope is nothing but an ember trying to stay alive. Ruth Ann Mercer sat propped against Calder's old patchwork pillows, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow, but her arms were full. She cradled her daughter close, a child they had almost buried before she ever breathed. There was color in the baby's cheeks now, faint but there. Her lips no longer blue, her skin less like wax. Mercy, they called her. The name hadn't come from a book or a family tree. It had come from the silence between survival and surrender. That evening, the fire cracked, slow in the hearth, burning pine and sagebrush. Its scent clung to the old wooden walls like memory. Ruth Ann, though weak, insisted on helping. She stirred a pot of porridge with trembling hands. Calder told her to rest, but she shook her head. "If I stop moving, I'll remember too much," she said softly. He didn't argue. Some things couldn't be taken away, not with kindness, not even with time. Ellie kept close to the baby, who now stirred in small movements, arms twitching like she was dreaming of warmth. She didn't cry, didn't coo, but she breathed. That was enough for now. In the quiet moments, Ruth Ann would hum an old tune. Not a lullaby, not really. Just a melody passed down from her mother, something with no words, only weight. Calder listened once, then again, letting it settle into the floorboards. Ellie asked, "What's she singing?" "A promise," Calder said. "One only she and the baby understand." That night, the stars showed themselves early. The wind outside had grown softer, more curious than cold. Calder stood at the window, rifle propped beside him. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it. The stillness wasn't peace. It was the space just before something arrived. Ruth Ann walked with help, each step an act of defiance. Calder watched her trace her hand across the old wood of the cabin wall, the way a person might reach for memory. She paused at a wooden crate near the hearth and sat beside it, folding old cloths into neat layers. "Ellie told me about you," she said, voice barely above the fire. "Said you were quiet, kind, safe. I'm just a man with a place, that's all." "No, it's more than that." "You opened the door." Calder didn't answer. He watched the flames. They said more than he ever could. Outside, Ellie practiced tying rope. Calder had shown her how earlier that day, out near the barn. She had asked for something to do, and when he gave her the rope, she didn't hesitate. "What are you tying for?" he'd asked, just in case she said. Now, as night deepened, Ellie sat cross-legged by the door, carving again. This time it was a bird, half-shaped, the wings still rough. "I want her to have something that flies," Ellie whispered. Ruth Ann smiled. "You're a good sister." Ellie looked down. He didn't think so. Dwight was wrong about a lot of things. Silence followed thick and deep. "Do you think he knows?" Ellie asked finally. "That we're not coming back?" Calder turned to the window. "If he doesn't, he will, soon." Ruth Ann shivered. Calder added another log to the fire. "We can leave," he offered quietly, "if that's what you want." Ruth Ann shook her head. "I ran once. This time I want to stand." The decision hung between them like smoke. Calder respected it, though it twisted something in his chest. He showed Ellie how to open the trapdoor hidden under the rug, a hollow space used for root storage, once now swept clean, padded with cloth. "She's small enough to fit down there if need be," Calder said. Ellie nodded, fingers tracing the edges. "I hope we don't have to use it." "So do I." Ruth Ann didn't flinch when Calder brought in extra water. She boiled it herself, cleaned cloths, and folded more diapers. Every action was steady, precise, like a soldier preparing for siege. When Calder came back from checking the corral, Ruth Ann stood in the middle of the cabin, holding Mercy to her chest. Her eyes met his. "Do you think he'll come here?" she asked. "Yes." "And when he does," Calder's voice was even, "he won't find what he left behind." She nodded. Her grip on the baby tightened. As the firelight flickered and the shadows danced along the beams, Ruth Ann moved to the window. "This house. It feels like a place that remembers. Like it keeps things safe. It's old," Calder said. "It's seen more than I care to guess." She turned to him, and for the first time her eyes softened. "Thank you for letting us inside." "I didn't let you in," he said. "You found your way. I just kept the fire going." Later that night, Calder stepped outside to check the sky. Stars stretched in every direction, wide and eternal. The kind of night that made a man feel both small and necessary. He returned to find Ruth Ann asleep on the cot, Mercy resting across her chest. Ellie was curled near the hearth, the wooden bird tucked under her arm. Calder sat by the fire, watching them. 3 lives that weren't his to protect, but somehow had become his burden. Or maybe his redemption. The wind whispered again outside, brushing against the windows like fingers trying to slip through cracks. Calder didn't move. He leaned back, eyes heavy, the fire crackling in soft lullaby. Somewhere out beyond the hills a man stirred. A horse pawed the earth, and the desert waited silent and wide to see what kind of promise would be kept by dawn. It started with the silence of animals. No crowing, no rustle, no snort from the barn. Calder knew that kind of stillness. It wasn't calm, it was warning. Something was shifting beneath the surface. The air itself had weight, and somewhere deep in his chest an old ache returned, not from age or injury but from instinct. He stood at the porch rail, coffee forgotten on the step, and watched the line where the valley met the sky. He'd mended fences here for a decade, fixed hinges, and plowed dry earth thinking the world had stopped caring about his little corner of it. But now he felt eyes again. Not friendly, not curious, hunting eyes. Inside the cabin, Ruth Ann folded another blanket with practiced hands. She moved slower these days, not just from exhaustion, but because every movement carried memory. The bruise on her cheek had faded, but not the shadow behind her eyes. Still, she stood straighter. She spoke with more certainty, and when she held Mercy, it was like she was holding more than a child. It was her voice, her right to stay alive. Ellie had changed too. She no longer asked permission. She swept the floors before being told. She checked the baby's breath in the night. She carved into the porch rail with a dull blade until Calder finally gave her a proper knife. "You sure about that?" Ruth Ann had asked. "She already knows how to cut," he said. "She's just learning to shape." That day, Calder walked the ridge just past noon. The sun was high and mean, but he wanted to see further than his boots. When he reached the bluff overlooking the creek bed, he stopped. There, in the dust, fresh tracks. A single rider, deep prints, heavy saddle. Calder narrowed his eyes. Dwight. He didn't head home right away. He sat there for a while on an old rock that remembered more storms than most men. He breathed in the desert and let it tell him what he already knew: the past was coming. As he made his way back, Calder noticed how quiet the land had become. Even the breeze seemed cautious. When he arrived at the cabin, he found the porch swept clean, the windows shuttered with care. Inside, Ellie was making a list in a whisper, her finger tapping items on a folded piece of cloth: diapers, milk, firewood, spoon matches. "Trying to stay ready," she said. "You are," Calder replied, meaning more than the supplies. Ellie braided a strip of cloth into Mercy's tiny basket that evening. "Mama always said, if you make a thing your own, it protects you better." Calder stood at the edge of the room, quiet. The way a man does when he knows danger can smell even the wrong word. That night he sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. Ellie watched, silent as always, but her fingers traced the wooden carving she had started days ago. "You ever kill anyone?" she asked. He didn't flinch. "Yes." "Did you want to know?" Calder said, and his voice cracked just a little. "But I had to protect someone." Ellie nodded slowly, not frightened, just trying to understand the shape of the world. She went back to the fire, pulled a blanket over Mercy's sleeping form, and stayed there humming the same low tune her mother had been singing days before. Ruth Ann approached Calder with quiet steps. "You'll be the one standing between us and him." "I already am," Calder said. "I know," she whispered, then added, "He won't stop, you know, even if he sees you. He doesn't stop. I've met men like him. They only know how to push until someone doesn't back up." That night the wind changed again. It didn't sing this time. It knocked, shook loose the rusted horseshoe above the barn door. It slammed the feed bin open. Calder didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, one boot on rifle resting across his lap. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that shifted like memories. Near dawn, he saw Ellie step out barefoot, her hair tangled from sleep. She sat beside him and showed him the porch rail. She had carved one final word. Mercy. She needs to know she matters, Ellie said. She does. Even if we don't make it, especially then. The sky in the east had begun to glow, faint but certain. That's when Calder saw it. A dust trail, not fast, not frantic, just steady. A rider who believed the world would step aside. He stood without a word and went back inside. He's close, he said to Ruth Ann. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She simply pulled Mercy closer and kissed her forehead. They moved like people who had done this before, not this exact thing, but something near it. Something where survival came down to seconds and sound. Bundles were tied. The trapdoor was cleared. Ruth Ann slipped the knife beneath the mattress and checked it twice. Ellie filled a flask with warm milk and folded 2 soft blankets into a corner. She paused at the door, looking back at the home they had built from ash and fear. "Will we be okay?" she asked. Calder didn't lie. "We'll be ready." He stood at the window once more, the sun just beginning to stretch long golden fingers across the floorboards. He wasn't afraid, not for himself, but he'd opened his door once, and now what was inside wasn't just company, it was family, not just the women, not just the child, but the hope. And hope wasn't something he was willing to lose again. The first sign was the horse. Not the sound of hooves, no, Dwight Mercer didn't ride like a man in a hurry. It was the shift in the air, the tightening of silence, the uneasy pacing of Calder's bay gelding in the barn. The animals felt it first, as they always did. Even the chickens, noisy, most mornings stayed tucked in their coop heads, low wings tight. The dust on the road east had begun to move in a rhythm, slow and deliberate. Calder watched it from the porch, his jaw clenched. He'd seen that kind of dust trail before, back when war still felt close. It belonged to a man who thought nothing could stop him, a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Dwight Mercer had found them, and he hadn't come for peace. Inside the cabin, Ruth Ann stood with Mercy in her arms. The baby stirred, whimpered, and Ruth soothed her with quiet humming, but her eyes never left the window. Ellie sat cross-legged near the hearth, clutching the wooden bird she had carved. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They'd all been waiting for this. Calder set the rifle by the door, its metal cool and clean. He didn't load it yet. He wanted Dwight to see him steady. He wanted to speak first, just once. Let the man know what had changed. The horse crested the ridge a few minutes later. Dwight didn't look tired. He looked sure. His coat, dusty and frayed at the seams, fluttered behind him like a warning flag. He carried a shotgun slung over one shoulder and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He dismounted with a single arrogant motion, boots hitting the dirt like thunder. Then he spoke. "Well, ain't this something?" he drawled, scanning the porch. "I come for what's mine." Calder stepped forward. "They're not yours." Dwight's smile twitched. "You got a badge?" Hayes, "No." "Then step aside." "No." Ruth Ann opened the cabin door and stepped out slowly. Mercy was wrapped tight in a quilt, her face barely visible. Ellie followed close behind, holding a small jar of oil in one hand, a strike match tucked into her sleeve. Dwight's eyes narrowed. "You told," he growled, his voice no longer smooth. "You little rat." Ellie didn't flinch. "I told the truth. You'll regret that." Ruth Ann stepped down from the porch, her voice quiet but clear. "Her name is Mercy." Dwight blinked. "What you tried to bury her nameless. But she lived. She has a name now." "Mercy?" Something in Dwight's face twisted. He reached slowly for the shotgun. Calder didn't move. "If you touch that iron, he said you won't touch the ground again." For a moment, Dwight froze. Then came the flash of movement, his hand dropping to the stock, his body turning. But Ellie was faster. She stepped forward and hurled the oil jar at his feet. It shattered on impact. Flame caught like breath on dry tinder curling up toward his boots. Dwight stumbled back, coat catching fire at the hem. He screamed, slapped at it, cursed. Calder closed the distance in 2 strides and slammed him to the ground. The shotgun skidded across the dirt. Calder pinned him with one knee and drove a fist into his chest, not with rage, but with finality. "I should finish you," he said. Dwight wheezed. "You can't. You ain't like me." "No," Calder said, "I'm not." A voice came from behind. "Ellie, let him go." Calder turned. "He'll come back." "No, he won't," she said. "He'll carry what he did. That's worse." The sheriff arrived an hour later, dusted from his own ride, face grim. He took one look at Dwight, burned, bruised, defeated, and didn't ask questions. Ruth Ann stood tall. Calder didn't say a word. Ellie handed the sheriff the broken matchbox. The sun climbed high above them, casting light on scorched earth. But the cabin stood untouched. Later, when the sheriff left with Dwight in chains, Calder found Ruth Ann on the porch steps. She was holding Mercy, the baby's eyes open now, flickering with something like wonder. "You still want to leave?" Calder asked. She shook her head slowly. "I don't think I ever did. You'll be talked about. They already talked. Let them remember this instead." Behind them, Ellie carved the final name into the porch beam. Mercy. Deep letters, steady hand. Not just a name anymore. A story. They sat in silence for a while after that. No one needed to fill the air. Even the wind seemed to pause, rustling the porch gently like it too was tired from the storm. Calder leaned back against the doorway and looked over at Ruth Ann and Mercy. The baby yawned a full tiny stretch of limbs and nestled deeper into her mother's arms. "What will you tell her?" Calder asked. Ruth Ann looked down at her daughter, then at the morning light stretching across the valley. "I'll tell her she was born from fire," she said. "And the fire didn't take her. It made her matter." Calder nodded slowly. "That's a story worth remembering." Ellie stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, holding her carved bird. She lifted it to the sunlight like it might take flight. "I think she gave us all our names," Ellie whispered. "Not just hers." Ruth Ann turned eyes glistening. "What do you mean, I mean?" "Mama became brave again. Calder became a protector. And me." Ellie smiled small, but real. "I became someone who can make something instead of just survive." The porch was quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of dread. It was something softer, like healing or peace, or the deep exhale that comes when danger has finally passed. Calder stood and picked up the rifle the one last time, not to use it, but to put it away. He laid it gently on the hooks above the hearth, inside where it belonged. Outside, the sky had turned a bright kind of blue, the kind you only see after the dust has settled. And in that light the name Mercy, carved into the rail, shone like a mark left by someone who had lived and changed everything. Yes, Calder thought this was the story they'd tell. The girl with no name, born into dust and fire. The girl who taught them all what it meant to stay. When all was said and done, after the dust had finally settled, the fire cooled, and the threats faded into the silence of the hills. What remained was not just a cabin or a family or a quiet patch of earth outside Laramie. What endured was a name. Mercy. She had been born in the dark, pulled from the edge of death, wrapped in nothing but the tattered threads of a broken mother's will. Her first breath was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was fragile, uncertain, yet it was there. And that alone was a rebellion against everything Dwight Mercer had tried to extinguish. against every man who believed that silence, shame, and fear could erase a life before it had a chance to begin. Mercy's story is not just about survival, it's about transformation. Ruth Ann, once voiceless beneath the weight of cruelty, found in her daughter the fire to speak again. Calder Hayes, a man who'd lived too long with Ghost, found purpose in protecting a family that had never asked for rescue, only refuge. And Ellie, just a girl, but carved from the kind of grit only hardship can shape, discovered the power in naming, in creating, in choosing. That cabin for a time was a place of healing. The floorboards still creaked with the old storm's memory, but laughter began to echo there too. The baby grew stronger. Her cries grew louder. Her eyes brighter. Ruth Ann told her stories by firelight, not of fairy queens or distant lands, but of women who had survived men who had chosen kindness, and daughters who made their own names matter. Ellie continued to carve. Not just birds or shapes, but words, hope, strength, begin. She etched them into beams, rails, doorposts, turning the home into a quiet monument of endurance. Calder mended the fences, and with time let his silence soften. He no longer stood always at the window waiting. Instead, he walked the fields, hand resting gently on Mercy's back as she toddled across the grass. But the greatest change wasn't in what they did. It was in how they saw one another. Ruth Ann was no longer someone who had escaped. She was someone who had chosen a different ending. Ellie wasn't just the witness of sorrow, she became its antidote. And Calder, long known as the quiet one, became something far more powerful, dependable. People in town did talk. Of course they did, but their words changed. Where once there had been rumors and sideways glances, now there were nods of respect. Miss Tilda kept a blanket folded near her store's stove in case Ellie ever stopped by. Sheriff Wade never asked questions about the rifle mounted over Calder's hearth, but he always checked their trail first when trouble was about. And Dwight Mercer. He sat in a cell, not just of bars and stone, but of memory, of fire, of names he could no longer deny. No one carved his into wood, no one whispered it in reverence. He became the caution, not the legacy. In the years that followed, the name Mercy traveled farther than any of them expected. The girl with eyes wide as the prairie and fists always curled found her way into stories passed around fires, church pews, and supper tables. But it wasn't just her survival that made folks remember. It was what she stirred in others, the courage to stay, to speak, to fight without hate. Because Mercy, as Calder once said, wasn't a name to pity. It was a name to honor. And perhaps that's what this story truly teaches us, that no beginning, however cruel or violent, gets the final say unless we let it. That even in a land where dust swallows dreams and fire burns futures, we can choose to write a different ending. One shaped not by fear, but by the simple radical act of staying. In our world today, where headlines roar and empathy grows thin, Mercy's story is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a reminder that resilience can be quiet, that bravery often looks like a woman holding her child, or a man standing without raising his voice, or a little girl who throws a match and refuses to run. Let Mercy be the name we speak when we think there's nothing left. Let her story be the one we tell when we need to remember what hope sounds like. Not loud, not grand, just steady. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or made you think of someone you love who's still fighting their way toward the light, then we ask you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, support our journey, and help us keep telling these kinds of stories. The ones that matter, the ones that live long after the fire goes out. Because every name deserves to be remembered, especially the ones born in silence and carried in love. Subscribe now and let's keep the legends alive.